All right, welcome back to lecture number 23. We are starting period 4. This is 4.1, contextualizing period 4. We are going to go into a brief overview of everything that happens in this historical period, which covers the years 1800 to 1848. Our learning objective for today is explain the context in which the Republic developed from 1800 to 1848. And our first learning objective deals with the new democratic society. So the United States began to develop a modern democracy and celebrated a new national culture, while Americans sought to define the nation's democratic ideals and change their society and institutions to match them. So this is a continuity from the third historical period. We have the Democratic Republicans winning the election of 1800 with Thomas Jefferson being the president. They were the party that wanted more power given to the common person. This is contrary to the Federalist Party, who had been the more elitist party. After the War of 1812, we have a new era of nationalism and patriotism that derives from how the United States did in the War of 1812. They did not lose. They maintained their independence against Britain. One of the heroes from that war was Andrew Jackson, and Jackson will run for president in 1824, will lose to John Quincy Adams, and in 1828 will win the presidency, and he will bring about the Jacksonian democracy. The Jacksonian democracy of the 1820s is also going to stress the importance of the common man. At this point, most white males who regardless of whether they have property or not, are able to vote. And so that's what the Jacksonian democracy is going to be. It's going to be stressing the importance of the common person. We are going to see an expansion of suffrage here. So the nation's transition to a more participatory democracy was achieved by expanding suffrage from a system based on property ownership to one based on voting by all adult white men. And it was accompanied by the growth of political parties. So these voting rights are expanded to all white adult males, regardless of the property that they have or do not have. In the 1820s, we're going to see a split between the Democratic Republican Party. In 1824, John Quincy Adams is going to steal the presidency away from Andrew Jackson. Jackson begins campaigning for president right away from 1824 to 1828, and now he is going to splinter off into the Democratic Party. When Jackson is president, he's going to be criticized for being like a king, being monarchical, and so the Whig Party of the United States is going to develop at the end of the 1820s. So the Whig Party in England had traditionally opposed the powers of the king, and this was a criticism of Jackson. That Whig Party is going to be led by Henry Clay, who you see in the bottom right of the screen. Now, the culture that was developing in the United States, we have, while Americans embraced a new national culture, various groups developed distinctive cultures of their own. So this new national culture is really based on this nationalism that happens in the early 1800s. We see it in art, we see it in literature. The Hudson River School of Art, as you see here, really emphasized the beauty of North America. We painted these large, very epic-looking landscapes. And regional cultures largely were still affected by geography, and then that geography affected the economy. So the South was still largely agrarian. The North begins to be more industrial. So northern states begin to focus more on manufacturing. And this is going to shape the views of both regions on government. So the North is going to want a stronger central government that's going to be able to impose tariffs to support and defend those domestic industries, while the southern states are going to want a weaker central government so that the tariffs are not put in place and the goods that they import continue to be cheap. Now, additionally, we also have distinctive cultures. So one of these is the Transcendentalist movement led by Ralph Waldo Emerson. They are questioning pre-established ideas of society, arguing for Americans to forge a new path. They emphasize skills and characteristics like self-reliance. That's something that's seen in Emerson's work. We also have another religious movement. Increasing numbers of Americans, many inspired by new religious and intellectual movements, worked primarily outside of government institutions to advance their ideals. So the Second Great Awakening takes place in the first half of the 19th century. Just like the first, we have religious revivals. They reinvigorate some of the old belief systems and they bring about new denominations. We have millennialisms who believe that the second coming is imminent, that Jesus is going to come back and there's going to be a reckoning. And they believe that that's going to happen in the 1840s. There is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So this is the Mormon Church, which is started by Joseph Smith. And all of these religious movements are going to inspire people to try to improve society, and that leads to many reform movements. One of the reform movements that really gained strength during this time is going to be the abolition movement. So on the right side here, you see a broadside that was printed depicting a moral map of the United States, and all the southern states that practice slavery are in dark ink. All right, so we have innovations in technology, agriculture, and commerce. They powerfully accelerate the American economy, precipitating profound changes to U.S. society and to national and regional identities. So some of these technologies are the steel plow, the mechanical reaper, the seed drill. They're making agriculture faster, more efficient, and therefore they are increasing the amount of agricultural exports, helping the economy grow. In the north, we have the factory system. Everything is getting mechanized. They're using hydroelectric power, so water that's flowing on streams that are naturally occurring in the north are powering these northern plants. And based on these economic differences, we have regional identities that's developed. The industrial north and the agrarian south become even more solidified. We also have developments in transportation. So new transportation systems and technologies dramatically expanded manufacturing and agricultural production. We have roads like the Cumberland Road, you've seen in the bottom right, canals like the Erie Canal, seen at the top, and steamboats. So steam engines begin to revolutionize transportation because now you can travel in rivers both downstream and upstream. So now the Mississippi River and the Ohio River, they become two-lane highways. No longer are they just going downriver. We do have railroads in the 1840s, though it's still at the very infancy of railroads. They are more prominent in the north, they're not yet standardized, and the telegraph allows for faster communication between the different regions. Samuel Morse will develop Morse code, which will help people communicate using the telegraph. All right, so the effects of the market revolution. So the market revolution was this industrialization period in the early 19th century in the United States, this growth of this factory movement. Now people are buying things, they're taking on wage labor, and the changes caused by the market revolution had significant effects on U.S. society, workers' lives, and gender and family roles. So one of the ways in which this affected women was that at first they were excluded from the factory system. They were not able to go and get jobs in wage labor in factory work. But then factory foremen realized that they could pay women a lot less, so it would become more efficient. And so these women here that you see are Lowell mill girls. So Lowell, Massachusetts was a place where the factory system really rose and grew. And the women that were allowed to work in the Lowell factories were usually single women. They could not be married, and then once they did marry or found someone to marry, they would be let go. With the rise of wage labor, we have a rise of workers' organizations and unions. But at this point, unions are not going to be at their strongest. So they're going to have a really big growth period in the next historical period, period 5. But at this point, we're only starting to see the beginnings of workers organizing and unionizing. We have economic developments shaping settlement and trade patterns. They help to unify the nation while also encouraging the growth of different regions. So the cotton gin is a good example of this. The cotton becomes a more profitable crop in the South because of how efficient it is to remove the seeds from the cotton fibers. And the cotton growers in the South are now becoming interdependent with the textile factories in the North. They're sending all of their cotton to northern factories, whereas before they were sending it mostly over to Europe. These new technologies are also helping to grow settlements in the western regions. So the roads that are reaching these western places, the canals, the railroads that will eventually get there are going to make communication faster, sending supplies over there, sending goods, and so it's going to help development go faster. All right, for foreign policy in this historical period is mostly going to be related to how the United States is going to expand its borders. So the U.S. interest in increasing foreign trade and expanding its national borders shaped the nation's foreign policy and spurred government and private initiatives. So the border expansion periods are seen here. Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The Spanish Florida annexation in 1819, the annexation of Texas in 1845, the Oregon Territory in 1844, that was done through a treaty with Great Britain, and then the California Territory in 1850, ceded by Mexico at the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So, struggling to create an independent global presence, the United States sought to claim territory throughout North American continent and promote foreign trade. The most important part of these border expansions was the Louisiana Purchase, because not only did it double the size of the United States, but it also allowed the United States to have complete control of the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. Now, before they purchased Louisiana, there were times in which it was controlled by Spain, and Spain would cut off access for the United States to New Orleans. So they would remove the rights of deposit. So they would have to pay extra money to send goods down and export them through New Orleans. This brings more stability to U.S. trade. And in the 1820s, James Monroe, the president, is going to attempt to keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. So you see James Monroe on the top right. His Secretary of State was John Quincy Adams, a very young John Quincy Adams in the bottom right there. He's the Secretary of State that drafts the Monroe Doctrine, basically saying that European powers should not interfere with any of the developing countries and republics in the Western Hemisphere. Otherwise, the United States is going to get involved. All right, and lastly here, we have the question of slavery continuing to grow. So the United States' acquisition of lands in the West gave rise to contests over the extension of slavery into new territories. So the question over slavery's expansion would arise every time that there'd be an addition of states. Attempts at keeping free states and slave states even was begun under the Missouri Compromise. So anytime that a new state was admitted into the Union, they would be given 2 Senate seats and then representation in the House of Representatives based on that state's population. But that state's population would be affected in slave states because the enslaved population would be added to that proportional formula by 3/5 per the Constitution. So in 1820, Missouri is up for statehood, and Benjamin Talmadge Jr., seen here in the bottom left, tries to introduce an amendment, the Talmadge Amendment, into the law that's going to make Missouri a state, saying that if Missouri becomes a state, they will continue to be free. They will not allow slavery within their boundaries. This gets the Southerners into a frenzy. They disagree about it. It nearly breaks the country apart, but in comes Henry Clay on the bottom right. He was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he drafts a compromise between the two sides. In order to keep the number of slave states and free states even, they will allow Missouri to enter the country as a slave state and break up the territory of Maine and introduce Maine as a free state. So that way the number of free states and slave states remains the same. Additionally, as the country continues to expand, there will be no slave states added above the Missouri southern border. So you see that green line on the map? That is going to be the Missouri Compromise line. And no slave states are going to be admitted above that line. That will continue to be the precedent through 1850. Now, we also have the abolitionist movement, like we mentioned, growing in the early 19th century. And one of the people who is very important for the abolitionist movement is David Walker, because he himself had been enslaved. And he writes a book called Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, in which he is making appeal to those who are enslaved or those who are black and have gained their freedom to press the white politicians and the people in power to end slavery. He is trying to encourage those who are enslaved to rebel against those who are enslaving them, their enslavers, and gain their freedom. And so his book was banned through most southern states. There were campaigns of trying to spread them throughout the South, and he was seen as a threat by the southern states. Unfortunately, he died young of tuberculosis, but he is starting to set this pattern of formerly enslaved people speaking up in favor of abolition. So the next famous person that we'll see here that is a black abolitionist is going to be Frederick Douglass, who's going to be our main promoter of black civil rights through the end of the century. He lives a very long life. All right, so finally, let's recap. We have a new democratic identity developed through the expansion of voting rights, nationalism seen in new American culture through art and literature. We have a second great awakening, bringing about new religious denominations and a reform movement. We have new technology, expanding transportation, communication, and the economy. And we have new technology reinforcing old gender norms and giving rise to labor organizations or unions. And America expands to its near current borders, but it had to be done through foreign policy, through wars and treaties. The slavery question is going to persist, especially with the expansion of the United States and the admission of states into the Union. All right, that is it for this lecture. I hope that you have a good gist of what's going to come in the rest of period 4. In the next lecture, we're going to dive deeper into the Jefferson presidency. So I will see you then.